All right, we're recording. Let's go ahead. Hello, I'd like to welcome Marlon Peterson to this conversation about the upEND movement, which is a movement dedicated to abolition of the child welfare system by reimagining a society where the forcible separation of children from their parents is no longer an acceptable intervention for families in need. A society where children and families are strengthened and supported rather than surveilled and separated. Marlon Peterson is the host of the Decarcerated Podcast and Atlantic Fellow for Racial Equity. He's also the founder and chief re-imaginator of the Precedential Group, a social justice consulting firm, and a 2015 recipient of the prestigious Soros Justice Fellowship. So Marlon, welcome. Thank you for being with us today. I thought we could start by just asking if there's anything else you'd like to tell us about you or your work. I know you have a book coming out soon, which I'm really excited about.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for having this platform. First, Alan, definitely for inviting me to be a part of this. I really do appreciate that, and all your colleagues there at the University of Houston School of Graduate School of Social Work. So this podcast is still available, and there's my book right now is tentatively set to be released next spring. The title is Bird Uncaged, an abolitionist memoir, which is interesting enough that it sort of coincides with the current moment. And I guess through the conversation we're going to get into to some extent, it really deals with, obviously, it's a memoir of my personal experiences through incarceration and whatnot, but really sort of telling the lens of like what abolitionism is through my experience of actually having to deal with these sort of things personally and obviously physically, actually, because I was somebody who was in actual bondage for a period of time.
Right. Well, thank you again for joining us. So we met last year at an event that we had at the Graduate College of Social Work at the University of Houston, where we were starting to explore the topic of abolition. It was called Reform or Abolish, Bringing Justice to the Criminal Justice System. And I remember you shared one line that I always think about a lot in terms of this upEND movement. So I'm going to read a quote of what you said. You said, "Criminal justice reform can be a conduit, but it must end with abolition. We should imagine a world without prisons, without police. Abolition needs to be a destination. We can't be afraid to say that." So I'm curious to know, what are your thoughts now with this conversation around defunding the police, which is a new idea for a lot of people, but it's really entering the mainstream now. But it's within the context of a larger abolition movement.
Yeah, I mean, abolition as a concept has existed ever since we came to these shores, right? And just in various iterations of it. And when it comes to the most recent issue, in this moment now, when folks are in the mainstream saying things like defund police or abolish prisons, this is a legacy and lineage of a lot of people who have been doing this work for a long time. Even in the contemporary moment, you think about Angela Davis, you think about Mariam Kaba, you think some folks have been doing this work in our contemporary time, Black women particularly, and give credit and kudos to those folks first and foremost. But the other thing about it is that, when I gave that talk at your school, which is a year ago, almost a year ago, at the end of the statement that you just read, I said it's something that we shouldn't be afraid to say. At that time, a year ago, saying the word abolition in any sort of quote unquote respectable institution or any conversation or debate would get you laughed out of the room, right? And now it's good to hear that folks are now embracing this to some extent. And there's some propositions out there, at least in some municipalities, to actually do the work of abolition. But I don't think that we're fully there yet. I still think it's still more taboo than anything else. I think a lot of it is just misunderstood of what it is and how it would look. And, we can credit that to our own just sort of like a lack of imagination. Part of what white racial superiority has done, at least as a mindset, as an ideology, is limit our imagination for what we are able and capable of creating for ourselves. And I think that's the part we need to grow out of. And we are in a place of having a conversation, which I'm thankful for and happy for. But the action needs, and the teeth behind the conversation needs to also evidence itself.
Yeah, I think you mentioned, the concept of just our imagination and the limits of that imagination. And I think that's probably a lot of the reason why society's been kind of stuck on this idea of reform. And it seems like a lot of the work of people who have been calling for abolition for many years is explaining why reform just isn't enough. Can you talk through like your journey of how you got to this place and any kind of epiphanies along the way that led you to where you are today to realize that reform is just not enough and we have to focus on abolition?
Yeah. I was going through some old records of things I've written over the years while I was still in prison. And for those, I spent a decade there. And I found a document that I had wrote. It was a letter I had, a copy of a letter that I did not mail home. That I guess I intended to mail it. And this was maybe in 2002. And it was like, it was them asking my family to send me some information about Angela Davis, like, how can we abolish prisons? Now, at that time, my conscious level of what that meant, I barely knew who Angela Davis was, to be quite frank. And now I think that where we're at right now, I think, here's the thing, Alan. The concept of abolishing prisons or police, particularly in this moment, is not only about what it is, what we don't want. I think that's a part of it. It's not only about what we do not want, right? It's about what we want, right? I mean, just imagine a world where we didn't need police, where we didn't need prisons. I think the idea of what we want scares us more so, which is why we don't approach it, right? And it's also because we haven't done enough, we haven't invested in it, in the idea enough to show that that's what we really want. So we have invested mainly in the things that we don't want. Right, we invested in police. We don't want police. We don't want sirens. Right, we don't want. When you're in your household, particularly if you're in a Zoom call and in your meetings, the first thing you do when a siren comes on, you say, "Excuse me, sorry for the background noise." We don't want that noise here, right? And what we're saying ultimately about abolition is that we want something different. We don't want that noise. We want peaceful communities. We want thriving neighborhoods. We want neighborhoods where gun violence is not an issue, not a concern. That's what that means, right? I think the white imagination, sadly, has only misconstrued it to saying that has limited our possibilities. But it's also limited the white imagination. Like, white people don't want it either. White institutions don't want it either. It's just limited because, the idea of the carceral state, prisons, police, et cetera, and other state actors, because prison and police are not the only way, aren't only like the law enforcement fuel parts of our government, our country. But it also, it prevents us from realizing what we're really capable as a community, as a society. And the limiting value of it is only causes more harm. Prisons cause more harm. Police are inadequate, and they realize it causes more harm than anything else because they ultimately say we're being asked to do things we can't do. They understand it as well. I just think because the racialization of law enforcement in this country is so powerful, it's so potent, it's so foundational that anytime we say anything, anytime the conversation around what we want, around self-actualization, around our communities, we can't help but deal with the racial impetus of it.
I think that idea of it's not just about what we don't want, but it's about what we do want, what we want to create is really important. This, the work, your work and other people who've been calling for abolition of the prison industrial complex for a long time has really influenced our work at upEND in the sense that we try to say, that isn't about just ending foster care. It's about thinking about a society in which families and communities are first responders to children in need, which families and communities are strengthened and supported rather than surveilled and separated by the state. So, we've really learned a lot from that idea that it's not just about ending something, it's about what we want to envision. So this movement, abolition of child welfare system, is part of this larger conversation about systems and the way they maintain white supremacy, the way they maintain anti-Blackness. What do you think about how are systems interconnected? A lot of times these systems purport to either help or reform Black people, but actually do neither. And sometimes involvement in one system actually leads to involvement in another system.
Yeah. Definitely. You hear about the school to prison pipeline. That's a system that's informed, that is funneling the prison system. That's a system that's separate. School is not supposed to be a place where people prepare you, where you're prepared for prison. The foster care system is also a system that prepares people for prison. The foster care to prison pipeline is an actual thing. And the data supports that. And these systems, once again, these systems are, in so many ways, also have these like racial undergirdings of them. in terms of how they perform and how they behave in the interaction with poor people of color, right? In terms of the racial impetus of it. And I think that it's just like the educational system, just like the education system is the same way, it deals with us in a different sort of way. It deals with largely from a punitive space. It takes its cues from the prison system, right? In terms of how we discard people and how we exclude people and how we don't give resources to people who need them, or how we don't tend to the mental instabilities of folks, or how we don't cater to the mental health of people, how we don't really pay attention to all the other factors that are contributing to why people are in these positions in the first place. I think COVID has, once again, right, this COVID pandemic has peeled the onion in terms of, like, that's a public safety issue there. And who is it impacting? It's impacting people of color disproportionately, just like the prison system does. Like, that's a connective tissue there in and of itself, that the very communities who are the most incarcerated, who are the most heavily and aggressively policed, are the same communities that are also disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. Like, these are all public health issues. You know what I mean? Violence in our communities is a public health issue. The pandemic is a public health issue. So, I mean, what that evidence is for us is that there's a preponderance of evidence that shows that the racialization of all of these systems are why people of color, Black folks particularly, are impacted negatively.
Yeah, and that's exactly the same thing that we see in the child welfare system. Black children have been overrepresented and over-involved in the system for decades. And the system has known about that. And there's been reform after reform trying to attempt to do something about that. And they've just been unable to address the problem. And it's in a lot of ways related to all these other systems, because you have mandated reporters in schools that are over-reporting Black children to the system. You have doctors and physicians in medical settings that are over-reporting Black children when they come to their attention with accidental injuries. Black children are more likely to be reported to child protective services systems. So we see the same thing in these systems, which is, I think, why these movements and these discussions about abolition are important. You mentioned that idea of recreation. That really reminds me of something else that you said when you spoke to us about that centering our thinking on abolition can open our minds about what we can create. And you said, I'm going to read you another quote. As a practical matter, prison abolition is less about closing actual prisons and more about opening up your mind, skill sets, and resources to what we can create. Prison abolition is a project of freedom visioning, justice creating with racial, gender, social, and economic equity as a guide. Why do you think when we're having these discussions about abolition, why is it important to start there, to really focus about what we can create?
Yeah, I mean, when slavery ended officially or unofficially, depending on how you look at it, in 1863, and then out of the Emancipation Proclamation, and then subsequent to the end of the Civil War 2 years later, Black folks particularly in the South, Black folks started to not only get elected and vote other Black folks into office, but there became these small thriving hubs in terms of what Black people create. These were former enslaved people, by the way, right? They came out and they started creating all these things around them, and then universities, schools and universities that formerly enslaved people created. When we think about abolition now, we have no clue about what we can create, right? As somebody who spent time in prison, I learned from some of the most genius people, right? And these were people who were discarded by humanity for various things that they may have committed. And I always throw this in there. I'm not absolving anybody for any harm they may have committed, but they were like geniuses inside these places. People who taught me, who groomed me in so many ways. I was a 19-year-old child in a sense, and there were older men in there who groomed me and taught me about so many things, not just about life experience, but about some of the ideology and theories that we now discuss today. I think when we open up our minds about what is possible, here's the thing. Imagine if we didn't have communities without gun violence, right? And there are communities now where people who have been formerly incarcerated, people who were formerly in gangs, or still maybe who were once in those sort of in gangs, are now playing a role in reducing violence in their communities in ways in which police haven't been able to do, right? Just think about that. And that is literally an abolitionist politic, right? And saying that people who have been the most impacted by things can also create the solution to the things that they've been impacted by.
Right.
but the limitation, like I like to say the white imagination, the limiting factor of the white imagination, it's in so many ways fearful of that possibility because it can render them irrelevant. It can render the police structure irrelevant. It can render the prison system irrelevant. And I remember maybe around the same time I gave this speech at your school, I was at a conference or a roundtable in Oakland with some police executives and some other scholars and other folks. Khalil Gibran Muhammad was one of the people in that room, somebody I look up to as well. And I posed a question to the law enforcement folks in the room of, when you hear activists, when you hear folks asking for the abolition of police or less policing, what do you hear? Like, what are you hearing when you hear? Do you hear we want chaos? There's no way in the world we saying that we want that chaos. Ultimately, he didn't have an answer for me. He just spoke about, the thing that they always do. He said, we get most of the 911 complaints from people in these communities, so that's why we need to be there, et cetera. That's, they blame the victim. But I just sort of think that when we think about what's possible, what Black folks are asking for, Black folks are asking for freedom, right? That's what abolition is. Like, Black folks have been asking for freedom, not asking, demanding it, resisting it, taking it by any means necessary. That's what we want, freedom. Freedom for us is freedom for everybody. When we feel completely free and when we are living fully self-actualized lives as a community, not just as individuals, that's better for everybody. That means it's less tense. It's less tense, right? But I think that's the part of the abolitionist politic that folks are not willing to open up their minds to hearing.
Right. What do you say to people that haven't imagined this before, who have never thought about the idea and don't see a blueprint for how this could work? What advice do you give them to start to expand their imaginations and envision this society that we could create without prisons?
We live in a society where we value possibilities, right? Reading is fundamental and all these sort of things that, these old, I'm a little older, I remember the commercial, reading is fundamental. And the reason why reading is fundamental, because reading education opens your mind up to possibilities, right? What you can do and what you can do for your community and the world. And I think folks should just really understand that I gotta say, what Black folks are asking for have been demanding, have been taken in bits and pieces over the centuries that we've been here. Well, folks are saying that we're asking you to understand that we want a better world for everybody. And that's the thing, I think that's the part where folks confuse freedom with power. We're not saying that our freedom doesn't take away from your personal power. Our freedom does take away from institutional power, but our freedom doesn't take away from your personal power. We are demanding personal power. That's what abolition is. I think folks should just understand that. Because here's the thing. Harriet Tubman was an outlaw. She was an absolute outlaw. They wanted her dead. The powers that be wanted her dead in that moment. What she was asking folks was to realize, particularly even the enslaved people who she was freeing, was to realize, like, yo, listen, you can be free. This is not the only life that's available to you. Right? That's when we talk about the shotgun, when she had to, put the gun in people and say, hey, you need to get out of here. She was trying to give people the option for possibilities, and she did it forcefully. She took it, right? And I'm saying we're in that same lineage. We're saying that we want people to understand that there's more to this, that it's possible to live in a community where there isn't intramural violence, right? It's possible to live in a community where Black folks, brown folks, indigenous folks, queer folks are not marginalized. Like, that's possible, and that's what abolitionist politics is, that we want to go forward in the society. We don't want to stay stagnant. We definitely don't want to go backwards.
Right. What do you, related to that idea of what's possible, what do you say to the people when there's opposition? I remember last year when you talked at our school, you talked about that opposition often comes in the form of people just saying that abolition isn't practical. It's not a practical solution. What do you say to those people?
Freedom wasn't, the end of slavery wasn't practical too, for a lot of folks. A lot of you literally could not imagine an America without Black folks working on plantations for free, right, and getting whooped and raped and stolen and kidnapped and sold. Like, people couldn't imagine that then. And when it happened, there was a backlash, right? That's how we got the Klan, right? I mean, it was a backlash against this possibility. So, I mean, where do you want to stand on history right now? Because here we are. I mean, there's going to be 100 years from now, 200 years from now, whether there's still the United States of America or there's some new iteration of it or what have you. And they'll have more access to history than we have now. And how you want to be read in that moment in time. Because there's a shift happening in our society that you need to get on the bus with. And it's not only happening here in America. I think, my travels allow me to see that, American racial strife is not an American, it's not exclusive to America. America does it best, but it's not exclusive to America. But also that folks around the world, indigenous folks, Black folks, and I like to say blackened folks, because you go to some people, indigenous folks in Australia, they consider themselves Black as well, and New Zealand as well. Could it connect with the struggle? But these folks are also raising a level of consciousness of what's possible. Yeah. And what's possible is a world where Black folks, indigenous folks, don't have to deal with these systems as intermediaries to freedom, right? We don't have to deal with police and prisons and the foster care system in a way that it stands itself as an intermediary to liberation. But this is the thing I'm saying is that we will ask for it, we will demand it, we will do levels of resistance for it, and we will take it in bits and pieces. I think that's also the story of history, and I just want folks to think about where do they want to be in this history, in this historical moment.
Right. Thanks. So the last question I want to ask you is how we can apply that to this movement to abolish the child welfare system as we know it, to end foster care. I think, there's a lot of people that are going to, what lessons can we learn? There's a lot of people that are going to say, children need to be protected. There's always going to be a problem of child abuse. Foster care might have its problems, but talking about abolishing it altogether just isn't a practical solution. What advice would you give to us?
Yeah. I mean, it's similar to what the prison conversation. I think where people in prison educated themselves, and there's a political education, a political awareness. We were able to articulate why the prison system doesn't work, right? Angela Davis is formerly incarcerated person, right? And you know what I mean? So she has direct experience. I think a level of political education for the young folks and the system actors within the foster care system is very important for folks to be able to understand how their particular issue is connected to the other systemic issues, other racialized systemic issues. I think we sometimes tend to see the folks in the foster care system because they are in need of some support. We see them only as empty containers of people who are, we have a deficit approach to them. I think when we have a level of political education within the foster care system amongst the people who are within that space, the young folks in their education, but also with the caseworkers, et cetera, I think it has to come from there because they understand it better than anyone else in terms of how to dismantle it, but not only how to, but why and why. Because how to dismantle it, why it needs to be dismantled, and also from them also come proposals and propositions for what the next iteration of what we can do to transform this need in the communities. There's a need that needs to be filled, and the foster care system is obviously not in its current state, is not filling the need of what's happening. The need is the same need as why folks are disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. The need is why people are disproportionately impacted by the prison system. The need is why people are disproportionately policed and aggressively policed. The needs are the same. We just think that we don't connect them enough. And I think that siloed approach is a problem. But also largely, once again, Alan, is the political education coming from those folks.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Marlon. I really appreciate it. I know that this work on abolition, prison abolition, has been going on for a long time, and the concepts and the ideas are so well thought out in terms of a real strategy to get there. I know that we can learn a lot from your work and the work of many others who have been involved in this work. So I really appreciate you sharing with us today and educating us about your work. How can people learn more about you, follow you, know when your book's coming out?
Yeah. Well, I mean, marlonpeterson.com is my website, but also follow me on Twitter, Instagram, _Marlon Peterson, and you can keep up with all the updates there.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. I really appreciate it, Marlon.
Thank you. Take care of yourself.
You too.